Managing industries at sea has never been simple. Far from land, across multiple jurisdictions, and costly to enforce, the ocean is one of the hardest places in the world to manage. But new technology is allowing us to watch the ocean like never before. Still, innovation comes with trade-offs. As artificial intelligence expands, questions are emerging about its environmental footprint, from water and energy use to the possibility of jobs being displaced. So how do we balance these risks with the unprecedented potential of technology to improve ocean governance? This is Ocean Intelligence, a natural justice series exploring how data, AI, and science are reshaping the world of fisheries and aquaculture. Welcome to the Natural Justice Podcast. Today marks a very special episode as it will be the first of a new tradition in this podcast, where I talk to a fisher to reflect on the topics of the past episodes, making sure we add the perspective of those that are living the reality of fisheries day in and day out. In past episodes, we spoke about electronic monitoring and increased transparency in fishing activity. And joining us today to start this new tradition is Joe Letourneau, a fisher out of Newbury, Massachusetts. He is using electronic monitoring for his vessel, so can definitely speak to that topic, but also involved in some technology solutions for seafood himself. Welcome, Joe. It's so good to have you on the podcast today.
Hey, good morning, Eva. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
To start, I always like to ask people to give a little bit of an introduction. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in fishing.
I am a first-generation fisherman. There's no generational fishing, no history in my family. It was just something that I was drawn to. I've always been a avid recreational angler, an outdoorsman, always been an entrepreneur, and it was just something that drew me to the commercial fishing industry 10 years ago. And I've done a lot in 10 years. I've learned a lot in 10 years, still learning. I was actually an auto mechanic by trade, so no exposure to commercial fishing prior to what I've done the last 10 years.
But I can imagine it possibly has come in hand that you're maybe with the boat very good at fixing things if need be.
It's been a necessity for a small operation to minimize costs, being mechanically sound and able to repair and fix things.
Yeah, exactly. A surprising combination, but I can imagine a very helpful one as well. So could you describe a little bit the fishery that you operate in? Because as we know, fisheries are really diverse, what target species, the gear, really the regulatory context, all of that really matters when we're having these types of discussions around responsible fisheries or technology. So yeah, if you could give a little bit of that context.
Yeah, sure. So my vessel is the fishing vessel Lady Rebecca, and like you mentioned, out of Newburyport, Massachusetts. It's a 42-foot PEI Nova Scotia lobster-style boat. We do 1 to 2 day trips, mostly central and western Gulf of Maine, maybe 50 to 80 miles offshore. The vessel uses exclusively hook and line tackle. Specifically, we use DNG electronic jigging machines, and those are essentially a small rail-mounted machine that automates what a fisherman would normally do with a fishing rod. They are highly programmable. They can jig however you determine you want it to jig, so you can cater it specifically to the feeding behaviors of species that you're targeting, thus also helping you avoid bycatch by programming the jigging in a way that avoids bycatch, which in my case are the bycatch of concern is cod. And with this gear type, I've been able to limit bycatch to approximately 1%. And specifically, our cod bycatch is approximately 0.5%, which is extremely good in the groundfish industry. We specialize in a premium quality handling. My vessel is known for employing the ikejime process on 100% of our catch to maximize shelf life, quality, and therefore value to the vessel.
Yeah, amazing. So what's the ikejime process exactly for anyone who's less familiar?
Yeah, the ikejime process is a centuries-old Japanese process that was originated by small village fishermen as a way to preserve their catch in an age before refrigeration and no availability of ice, so that they could make the longer trip to the city or to the larger economic areas where they could get a better price for their fish. I'm sure there were other drivers to its discovery, but its focus is to prohibit or limit the fish from experiencing stress and all the
Mm-hmm.
biochemical reactions that occur in the fish as a result of that stress. And we could do a whole podcast on that separately, but it maximizes quality, shelf life, flavor, texture, appearance, all the markers of quality.
I have done some work on animal welfare, and the stressing is of course really bad on the welfare and the health side, but also will really negatively impact the quality. So that's very interesting to hear about that technique in fisheries. And then when you say we, I believe you mentioned you have one deckhand, right? So we're really talking about quite like small scale operations.
Yep, I got one deckhand. His name is Harrison. He's been with me going on 7 years now. So it's just the two of us on every trip. So it is definitely a small scale operation.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. And then what kind of I mentioned that you use electronic monitoring, which I guess is quite special for smaller scale operations, as at least on a regulatory level, it is mostly rolled out right now for larger industrial vessels. What kind of inspired you to work with that technology? And do you have other technology on board or hardware, basically, that could be relevant for our discussion?
Yeah, so a little background about why I'm using electronic monitoring. So I fish in the Northeast multi-species fishery. So that includes 13 regulated groundfish species, the prominent ones, cod, haddock, pollock, Acadian redfish, all the flounders, flatfish. So I target pollock specifically because that's what my gear type is suited for, and they're also abundant and underutilized, meaning we only harvest approximately 17 to 20% of our total allowable catch each year. So it's not a quota restrictive species. So the electronic monitoring, the fishery is required to have varying levels of observer coverage. And that percentage of coverage varies year to year. I believe right now we're at somewhere around 70% of trips must be observer coverage. So in order to meet that guideline, that mandate, you either have to take a human observer, a person from an observer company that comes out and measures discarded catch quantity, asks you a bunch of questions about the operation and expenses. And so for me on a small vessel, and I know anyone with a small vessel has the same challenge, adding another body to the operation is a significant, burden on our normal operation, whether it's just general space moving about the cabin, bunk space, if it's an overnight trip, food and fresh water rations, you're increasing my people on the boat by 50%. So thus all
Mm-hmm.
the supplies. So it became a real challenge. So I got into the electronic monitoring under a pilot project 8, 9 years ago, if I had to guess. And for me, it was just a way to not have to bring another person. I was skeptical with the effect it would have on my normal operations. And I know it varies depending on the vessel, what kind of implications it has on their process. For me, it worked out well, and I've had it ever since.
Yeah, we've had multiple discussions, including in this series, about kind of how electronic monitoring and observers can work together, which sometimes is on board, sometimes it's more in the review of the footage afterwards. But spoke to a fisherman before who also operated small scale boats. And he said, I simply can't put a person there. I'm happy to show what I'm doing, but it just doesn't fit. Talking a little bit more about electronic monitoring in the first two episodes of this series, there was quite a bit that we talked about in terms of the cost, because, and I think sometimes people are not aware of this, but cost for, the hardware, software, etc., really often will sit with the operators, and it's not necessarily guaranteed or easy to get a return on investment on that. What have been your experiences here in this context?
Yeah, so I got into, because I was in the pilot project early and I've tested multiple variations of the system. The equipment itself was no cost to me through the pilot process. Currently, I don't know if they've begun charging for it, but eventually that cost of equipment will fall on the fisherman, the vessel owner. As far as the cost of review or the cost of a human observer, which is I believe somewhere around $750 a day, that I guess currently it's being covered through some sort of government appropriations, but it is the responsibility of the fishery. That burden does fall on the fisherman. So there's kind of they kind of hold it over our head every year. There's uncertainty of whether the funding will be appropriated to continue to cover the costs, or will it be passed on to the fishermen. So although we currently are not paying for it out of pocket, that threat is always above us.
Yeah, and 750 a day, that is really quite significant.
Yes, my entire trip costs are around $700. So it slightly more than doubles my total trip expenses and would immediately make the operation far less viable.
Something else that came up with electronic monitoring is how it can help reduce the catch of bycatch or the catch of juveniles, for instance, because electronic monitoring can be quite good at scanning and then measuring and making an estimate of fish that's caught. And we know that avoiding juveniles, for instance, is in everyone's interest. It's in the interest of the fishermen as well as of the environment more generally. Is this something that is relevant to your fishery? So, catching juveniles, is that a relevant issue? And have you actually found that electronic monitoring in this context is helpful?
Yeah, so catching juveniles, especially in any quota managed fishery, is always a concern. Because our quota for our discount, a portion of our discards is counted against us. So no one wants to catch juvenile fish. It's not good for the fishery. It's not good for time management. For me, the electronic monitoring has no way to have an effect on what I catch, but I think it certainly can start the data collection in a historical record that you can reference to start to notice trends on where and when in certain conditions you are catching those juvenile fish. So to me, I think it's more of a data collection and being able to point out trends and use it as a reference, but I don't have any application where it would actually reduce the level of bycatch.
Yeah, I guess it would be more over a longer period of time having that reliable data collection, then it can help to inform, I guess, the techniques or decision making that will ultimately avoid those juveniles. And you already mentioned that for bycatch, for instance, because of your fishing technique, you have really quite a low percentage. So I guess
Yes.
you didn't really need much help there. Like there is maybe not so much data to collect, but maybe more broadly for the fishery, if you're looking at the fishing methods that are generally employed, would you think electronic monitoring and kind of the data collection coming from that would be helpful in that context?
Yeah, again, I don't think it would affect what's actually caught, but I think it would be a useful tool for any fisherman to establish a catalog of historical information.
Mm-hmm.
On the flip side, for a vessel like me that has achieved an extremely low bycatch, it does serve as a good tool to confirm that,
Hmm.
because the industry is full of claims about sustainability and greenwashing. And so has definitely proven to be a tool that I can add to others that just validates my claims about my product and its sustainability and low bycatch.
Yeah, you're in a way always collecting evidence of your claims and really showing I have nothing to hide. And if possibly there is some sort of claim that you've done something differently, you actually would have the evidence to back that up. So I can imagine that's helpful in that sense.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point there, and that is that it can be used as a tool to defend yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is discussions ongoing. I was part of a workshop last year where they were starting to answer. A lot of fishermen have questions about what the video is being used for. They want a clear answer. Is it strictly for, data collection of catch? Does the government plan to use it for enforcement and violations? And I don't know if anyone's gotten a straight answer on that. I've kind of let it off my radar because I, follow all the fisheries regulations. So, but again, then it can be used as a way that if there ever is anything brought into question about my vessel, I have 24 hours set, 24-hour coverage dock to dock of my vessel. So it is a tool to be used if needed in that way.
Yeah, and I think this brings up an interesting, we were in Boston very recently, and very often at these panel discussions, it's kind of around like, oh, we need that full traceability and the data because we need to know kind of from the end consumer going down to the production level, we need to know where the seafood is coming from. But then someone mentioned like, if you flip that around, we're always asking for this information from the fishers or farmers without actually communicating to them where all of that information then goes to. So, it should kind of work both ways, where there is transparency in what kind of information we're sharing. And that actually brings me to a question I wanted to ask you about something the sector often relates to as fisheries transparency. I prefer to call it data sharing because transparency implies publication, where there can also just be data sharing between different entities, but it's not necessarily shared publicly. So in this episode, we looked particularly at vessel tracking data, but I know some research institutes are also very interested in catch data, including those like bycatch or juvenile numbers. As a fisher, what advice would you give any of those organizations, whether it's governmental, whether it's an NGO, science, to say, okay, if you're really trying to increase the amount of data that's collected at the fisheries level, keep this in mind? Because I feel like sometimes it's very much approached from the side of, okay, this is what we need, but not so much in meeting people where they're at. And, maybe are there any concerns that fishers have in this context?
So that's a very loaded question. So I think one of the biggest reservations of fishermen for getting is just what you said, is how is the data going to be used? Because the industry is full of a history of, government regulators and NGOs using our data against us. And I won't bring up specific cases, but they're numerous and well documented. And so the fishermen have every right to be concerned, to be hesitant, to be worried, because that data has been misused before. So I think the biggest piece of advice is these organizations that need this catch data is to just really be transparent and honest about how the data plans to be used, hopeful outcomes of the data, because unfortunately there's often some ulterior agenda behind this data collection, and that's what the fishermen need. They need to know exactly where it's going so they can make their own informed decision.
Yeah, which I think is something that if people would relate them to themselves and their own position, they would have full empathy for that position, especially considering I wouldn't even necessarily, this is just completely from my perspective, but what I see sometimes, a demonization of companies, whether it's supply chain companies or the fishers, even still companies being sued over certain, sustainability claims or efforts, where it's like, well, they're actually the ones that are trying to be transparent, and then you're punishing people for that. That's, in what world is that going to actually lead to increased fisheries transparency if you completely destroy people's trust that way? So I think that makes perfect sense, having more of that transparency and honesty, because I think we all know that if anyone is invested in the future of fisheries, it's fishers, right? I want to switch to a slightly different topic, which is not so much reflecting on the past few episodes, but actually rather diving into a technology solution that you've worked with yourself. It's called Certi Harvest. Can you explain what this is, and then maybe also add, why did you find, as someone really working in this industry, that this is something where it's like, okay, I'm going to invest my time and energy into this. It's really helpful for us.
Yeah, so Certa Harvest is a startup company and it's fisherman founded. And I always make sure to point that out because that's where its roots come from on the water. And I've partnered with them as a industry advisor and founding validation partner. And what they're doing is they're filling what I feel is a much needed gap in the seafood traceability world. And that's the first mile, call it, what happens on the deck of the boat. Most seafood traceability infrastructure starts at the dock, or if it does start at sea, it's minimal. And everything else along the supply chain is any type of quality assertions are really just assumptions based on what the last guy told you. So what Certa Harvest is doing is they're validating time, location, temperature, gear type, and handling method all on the deck of my boat at time of catch using a data collection sensor that goes with the fish and stays with the fish through the whole supply chain all the way to the end user, and that develops a QR code for the chef or market to advertise forward facing to their consumer, and their consumer can then get every bit of data that has been collected on that fish from time of catch, time out of the water, essentially to their plate.
And is that specifically only for seafood that goes to hospitality directly, or could it also be that goes into a slightly longer supply chain?
Yeah, ultimately the goal is to have it go through the whole supply chain regardless of the setup. There are value propositions that the platform offers at every different level. Like one unique value prop for someone in like a mid-level wholesale who's bought it from a distributor and might be then selling it to other smaller wholesalers or chefs is the system develops a advanced shipment notice, so that mid-level guy will know that fish is coming to him when it comes out of the water and it's on my boat. So for a guy like that, the main value proposition is, sales planning, knowing that fish is coming in ahead of time and knowing it's from a certified, validated harvester. So he doesn't even have to wait for that fish to show up to confirm its quality. He can see the live quality of it based on the cold chain and the handling type ahead of time. So he already knows where that fish is going when it shows up at his door and he has a early notice. So that's
Mm-hmm.
one way that there's different levels and different value you can find in Certa Harvest. For me, as a small scale wild harvester, regardless of what happens down the chain from my vessel, it's hard for a small operation who's delivering on all the quality benchmarks, all the sustainability benchmarks. I like to say, my operation checks every box. But how do you break through the marketing noise of the
Mm-hmm.
seafood world today where some of my competitors might have, marketing departments and social media guys, and the industry is just full of, sushi grade, A1, the best, top of the catch, all these marketing terms, and nothing is validated.
Right? You can just say it.
Yeah, so this is a tool for me to say, don't believe them, don't believe me,
Mm-hmm.
here's the proof.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I've also read in some articles, particularly about then small scale fishing, that, it can be really challenging with getting the right price for your product because it's kind of beyond your control, right? And maybe that's something you can elaborate on a little bit. And that technology is then, there have been some small scale fishers that have been successful in then setting up direct line to their customer, especially if it's hospitality, especially if they deliver a higher quality fish, where then they end up getting a much better profit margin at the end of the day. But not everyone has that capacity to invest time and energy into that. So that technology can create some efficiency there as well. And in that sense, really help small scale fishing as well. So maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of dynamics for anyone who's maybe not so familiar with that. Like what happens, what kind of determines the price of the fish you catch, and to what extent does the fact that you have a higher quality fish where you've really paid a lot of attention to stress before the capture, is that something that's then recognized when you're selling your fish in kind of the current system?
Yeah, so for years, when I started really focusing on quality, when I began this, I was getting discouraged with pricing. The normal system is set up for volume. It makes a smaller volume niche product hard to differentiate through the supply chain. So most fish goes to auctions or, other fish houses. It gets sorted, recorded, and then it gets distributed to endless number of people down the chain. And it's anonymous. Once that fish leaves
Mhm.
the deck of the boat, it rarely is the name of the harvester attached to it. So that connection to its source is lost. I always say our best hope for competing as small scale harvesters is on storytelling. It's that connection and the quality. We can't compete on price. We can't compete on availability, which price and availability is the two main drivers in the commodity fish landscape. Supply's down, price is up, vice versa. It's pretty basic. And it's, there are rare occasions where it will vary, but those are the ultimate drivers.
Well, that's, I think, all really super interesting to know and kind of better understand exactly that dynamics. And I think for people that don't really work on the water, that can be a challenge, but I think so important for everyone to consider that, and that with all of these different technology or any other sustainability solution, that we're always connecting it to the practice and making sure there's that return on investment, that it's really solving a problem. Is there anything else you would like to add in this context of fishery sustainability in your region, technology, and how that's leveraged?
I would like to add something to the market side of it that we just
Mm-hmm.
discussed. So you would ask about prices, and for years, my efforts on attention to quality fell flat on bringing return on investment for pricing because my product, again, was stuck in that commodity volume system. And that's where a lot of fishermen that want to focus on quality, because there are plenty, almost every fisherman wants to know he's delivering a quality product. And there are limitations
Right.
based on gear type and vessel that limit that. The big thing is if they deliver a product that they feel is quality and they put extra effort into it and they don't see the price, then what was the point? So they get
Mm-hmm.
discouraged. It's like a chicken and an egg thing. You need them both at the same time.
Yeah.
I stuck with it and decided to market, even though I don't sell my own fish. My fish goes to Red's Best in Boston, my sole distributor, but I network and reach out to chefs, markets, promote my fish, share my methods, share the validating science that I've done behind my methods. So I generate my own demand, but still sell through the existing infrastructure to get the fish to the end user.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me and considering my perspective and the industry's perspective. Thank you.